In the heart of St. Marian's Hospital, a place where life often bloomed and withered in equal measure, the night shift always carried with it a certain stillness. The maternity ward, typically filled with the joyful cries of newborns and the exhausted relief of new parents, was unnervingly quiet this stormy evening. Rain lashed against the tall windows, the sound mimicking the rhythm of a racing heart. The air was thick with the weight of something unsaid, something felt but unseen. Nurse Evelyn Harper, a seasoned nurse who had witnessed more than 2 decades of life's first breaths and last gasps, was the only one on duty in the nursery tonight. She was no stranger to the complexities of birth. She had seen miracles happen. But she had also seen too many young lives fade away before they even began. And tonight, that bitter truth had visited her once again. Earlier that evening, 2 newborns had been placed under her care. Oliver, a chubby, healthy boy with a full head of dark hair, had been born just after midnight to a young couple who had long struggled with infertility. The joy they expressed when they first saw him had been enough to warm even Evelyn's tired heart. The other baby, Amelia, was much smaller. She had arrived too early, her body frail and translucent, her lungs too underdeveloped to sustain life on their own. Amelia had been in the NICU for days, but tonight, her tiny body had given out. The doctors had done all they could, but she had slipped away quietly, leaving behind nothing but sorrow. Evelyn had known this day would come, but it didn't make it any easier. The little girl had fought so hard, and yet her tiny, flickering flame had been extinguished before she ever had the chance to truly live. She had wrapped Amelia's body in a soft, white blanket, trying to hold back the tears as she prepared the baby for her grieving parents to say their final goodbyes. She was about to wheel the bassinet to the morgue when she paused, staring at the 2 bassinets, side by side. Oliver, alive and full of promise, and Amelia, cold and silent, as though they were symbols of life and death juxtaposed against each other. An odd, unexplainable urge pulled at her, a need to place the 2 babies together. Perhaps it was foolish, a sentimental gesture born out of the need to feel that Amelia wasn't alone. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something she couldn't fully grasp. Evelyn hesitated. She knew it wasn't protocol, putting a healthy, living child next to one that had passed away. But tonight, the normal rules didn't seem to apply. The hospital felt different. As if the boundary between life and death had grown thin. And against her better judgment, she carefully picked up Oliver, his warm little body wriggling in her arms, and gently placed him next to Amelia in the bassinet. For a moment, nothing happened. Oliver gurgled softly, his tiny fingers stretching out. His warmth contrasted sharply with the cold stillness of Amelia's form. Evelyn stood there, watching, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over her. Maybe, she thought, it was just her way of saying goodbye, but then, just as she was about to turn away, something strange happened. A soft, barely audible sound, like a sigh, escaped from Amelia's lips. Evelyn froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. It couldn't be. She had checked the baby herself. Amelia was gone. The doctors had confirmed it. Yet, there it was again, a faint, unmistakable sound of breath. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Her hands shook as she leaned in closer, her face mere inches from the baby's. Amelia's chest, once still and lifeless, was now moving, rising and falling in shallow, delicate breaths. Her fingers twitched, her eyelids fluttered. The color that had drained from her skin slowly began to return. Evelyn stumbled back, her mind racing to make sense of what she was witnessing. Was it a reflex? A post-mortem spasm? But no, this was different. Amelia was breathing. Her heart was beating. Frantically, she pressed the call button for the doctors. Within seconds, they flooded into the room, their faces etched with disbelief. They checked the monitors, rechecked her vitals, ran every test they could. But no one had an explanation for what had happened. Amelia had been declared dead, her heart had stopped for over an hour, and now she was alive. As the doctors scrambled to comprehend the impossible, Evelyn noticed something alarming. Oliver, who had been robust and healthy just moments ago, was now lying unnaturally still. His face, once full of life, seemed to have paled, his breathing shallow and labored. Panic surged through her. She rushed to his side, feeling for his pulse. It was weak. Too weak. The doctors, still reeling from Amelia's miraculous revival, quickly turned their attention to Oliver. They rushed him to the neonatal intensive care unit, trying to stabilize him. But the turnaround was stark. The healthy baby boy, who had been thriving just an hour ago, was now fighting for his life, his condition deteriorating rapidly. Evelyn stood in the hallway, her mind spinning. How could this be? It felt as though the very essence of life had shifted between the two babies. As if Amelia had somehow drawn vitality from Oliver. It was a thought too disturbing to entertain, but as the hours passed, it became harder to ignore. The following day, the hospital was in a state of bewilderment. News of Amelia's recovery spread like wildfire through the staff. The medical team pored over her charts, trying to make sense of what had occurred. Meanwhile, Oliver's condition worsened. The once joyful couple who had eagerly awaited his arrival now sat in the waiting room, their faces etched with the fear of losing the child they had fought so hard to bring into the world. Evelyn, unable to shake the weight of her actions, couldn't help but wonder if she had caused this. She thought back to that strange moment when she had placed the babies together, a moment driven by a sense of intuition she could no longer explain. She had never believed in the supernatural, in forces beyond the realm of science. But now, standing in the cold, sterile halls of the hospital, she couldn't deny that something beyond her understanding had taken place. As Nurse Evelyn walked the halls, lost in her thoughts, the events of the previous night played over and over in her mind. She had always been pragmatic, grounded in the realities of medicine and science. But no explanation, no matter how hard she tried to rationalize it, could make sense of what had happened. Amelia had been dead. And now, she was alive. Meanwhile, Oliver, who had been the picture of health, was slipping away. Days passed, and the hospital's atmosphere grew heavier with each passing hour. Doctors and nurses whispered in hushed tones about the miracle that had taken place in the nursery. But the other side of the story, the inexplicable decline of Oliver, loomed like a dark cloud over everyone's joy for Amelia. They began to speak in fearful, almost superstitious whispers when they thought no one was listening. Some said that the babies' lives had somehow become entangled. Others suggested darker things, curses, fate, even life force exchanges, as absurd as it sounded. But Evelyn knew one thing for certain: something had shifted the balance between life and death, and she was at the center of it. She avoided Amelia's room, her stomach knotting every time she walked past it. The sight of the once fragile baby now smiling and kicking in her crib filled Evelyn with a sickening mix of awe and dread. Every step she took closer to the NICU, where Oliver lay fighting for his life, felt like she was walking toward her own guilt. It wasn't long before strange things began happening around the hospital. Lights flickered when Evelyn was near, sudden chills swept through rooms where moments earlier everything had been normal. Machines that had been working fine suddenly malfunctioned in her presence. The nurses on her shift began avoiding her, though no one dared to confront her outright. A sense of foreboding had descended on the entire ward, and Evelyn found herself unable to sleep, her dreams filled with shadowy figures and cryptic whispers she could never quite remember upon waking. One night, about a week after the incident, Evelyn was sitting alone in the nurse's station, her face pale and gaunt from exhaustion. She hadn't left the hospital since Oliver's condition had worsened. The sound of monitors beeping and the low murmur of the night staff faded into the background as she stared at the clock, each tick bringing her closer to some invisible deadline she could feel but not understand. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. She could see her breath in the air, an unnatural coldness settling over her like a shroud. The lights above her began to dim, and as they did, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist, as if alive. Then, she saw it, a figure in the reflection of the glass window separating the nurse's station from the hallway. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but as she turned, her breath hitched in her throat. The shadowy figure from her dreams, the one that had whispered to her, was standing in the doorway. Tall and imposing, its form was undefined, a mass of dark, swirling energy with eyes that gleamed like embers. Evelyn's heart raced, her body frozen in place. It was as though the very air had become heavy, thick with something malevolent. What are you? She whispered, her voice trembling. The figure moved closer, though its feet made no sound on the tile floor. It seemed to glide, its presence filling the room with a sense of dread. When it spoke, its voice was a low, resonant hum, vibrating in Evelyn's bones. "I am the keeper of the balance," it said, its voice neither male nor female, but something ancient, something that transcended human understanding. "You have disrupted the order." Evelyn's mind raced. The balance? Was it talking about life and death? "The babies? I didn't mean to," she stammered. I didn't know." The figure's gaze bore into her, and for a moment, she felt as though her soul had been laid bare before it. Intent is irrelevant. The balance must be maintained. Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes. "But Oliver, he's just a baby. Why does he have to die?" "The debt must be paid," the figure intoned, as though reciting a law older than time itself. "Two lives cannot occupy the same space. One must pass so the other may remain." Evelyn's mind raced. Was there some way to stop this? Some way to reverse what had happened? Her eyes filled with desperation. What if I take his place? What if I give my life for his? The figure paused, considering her offer for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then, slowly, it shook its head. "You are not bound to their fate. The exchange was made between them. You cannot interfere." Evelyn collapsed into the chair behind her, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Then what can I do? There has to be something." The shadowy figure loomed closer, its presence almost suffocating now. "You have already done too much. Life and death are in motion. The scales will tip, and nothing can stop them now." With that, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the darkness from which it had come. As it vanished, the temperature in the room returned to normal, and the lights flickered back to life. But the sense of dread, of impending doom, lingered in the air. The next morning, Oliver's condition took a drastic turn for the worse. His parents, devastated and inconsolable, sat by his side as the doctors told them that there was nothing more they could do. The machines beeped softly, but his once strong, rhythmic heartbeat was now a faint, irregular murmur. Evelyn stood outside the NICU, watching from the hallway as Oliver's parents wept over their son. She wanted to rush in, to beg the doctors to try harder, to do more. But she knew, deep down, that there was nothing they could do. The balance had been upset, and now it was being restored. That evening, as the sun set behind the clouds, casting long shadows over the hospital, Oliver passed away. His parents held him in their arms as his last breath left his tiny body, and the monitors fell silent. In another room, Amelia lay in her crib, healthy and strong, her future bright. She had been given a second chance at life, but the cost had been high. And no one, not the doctors, not the nurses, and certainly not Evelyn, could explain why. The hospital fell into an eerie silence. The excitement over Amelia's recovery had been swallowed by the tragedy of Oliver's death. The staff avoided eye contact, their once firm faith in the logic of medicine now shaken by the inexplicable events of that night. Evelyn, haunted and broken, left St. Marian's Hospital for the last time the following week. She could no longer bear to walk those halls, to see the faces of the children she had once cared for, knowing that she had been part of something that defied the very essence of her profession, something unnatural. Years later, whispers about the "miracle babies" of St. Marian's would still echo through the hospital's corridors. A story passed down between nurses in the quiet hours of the night. But no one ever spoke of Nurse Evelyn Harper again, the woman who had witnessed life and death in their most mysterious forms, and who had paid the price for it. As for Evelyn herself, she lived in quiet isolation, never telling anyone the full story of what had happened that stormy night. She carried the weight of those two lives, Amelia and Oliver, deep in her heart, knowing that some mysteries, no matter how desperately we seek answers, are meant to remain unsolved, and in the darkest hours of the night, when the wind howled and the shadows seemed to stretch a little too long, she would still hear that voice, whispering through the silence, "The balance has been restored."